Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Wednesday, and for a long time, once upon a time, Wednesday was New Comic Book Day, when floppy issues of monthly and weekly comics from Marvel and DC, the two premier publishers of superhero comics, would go to local comic shops, to your LCS, and before that, to stores, drugstores, bookstores, that sort of thing. And the reason I say once upon a time is because Wednesday Comics, New Comic Book Day, looks like it might be over forever. Of course, this global pandemic, almost immediately, once countries woke up to the severity of this thing, once people and counties and states woke up to the severity of this thing, they immediately started enacting rules and regulations that cut the wheat from the chaff in terms of retail outlets. If you're serving food, you can stay open. If you're selling comic books, you can't stay open. You can't stay open for business anymore. And most of the comic books were for decades sold to specialty shops, so that you couldn't get comic books anywhere else. You couldn't go to the drugstore and get Superman most of the time. And most of those shops were hit hard by George W. Bush's Great Recession and barely recovered, and have been losing readership for a long time. Now, if you're on YouTube and you look at the Comicsgate side of YouTube, they will have a ready-made answer for why that is, which is that comic book creators, the writers and artists, on social media have been so serially awful to fans, just to readers and customers, so behaving so poorly, so unprofessionally, that naturally the fans went elsewhere. And that without that core group of 40-something men, the superhero comic book industry was, of course, going to be hard hit. That's one answer. It's the reprehensible behavior of those pros is certainly beyond dispute, right? We have the internet, so we have a record of how they behaved. The people that they were behaving towards don't have clean hands. That part tends to be overlooked by Comicsgate channels. But there are other reasons too. I mean, it's possible that comics would have been declining anyway if not for the weird speculator boom that struck in the 90s. That could be a factor. That was never going to last for very long. And there's one other factor too that Comicsgate channels, some of the best of them, have been pointing out for years now, and which I think could have a lot to do with the industry's decline, which is that the individual comics tended to be so bad, just so bad, poorly written, poorly drawn, fewer pages with huge amount more in-house ads, so that if you're like me and you've been buying comics your whole life, you buy the latest issue of the Teen Titans or the Justice League or the X-Men, and you read it in 5 minutes and have the number one feeling that you tend to have when you're finished is, boy, that was a waste of money. That just wasn't worth it. It wasn't very good, and there wasn't very much of it. One way or another, all of those things combined to make it a very hard time for comic shops. And that was before a global pandemic that forced them to shut their doors and forced them to have no foot traffic. So a lot of those shops weren't going to survive anyway. Even they didn't have the wherewithal. Recessions and thin years had left them with no cash reserves, so they didn't have the wherewithal. And I imagine that a lot of those local comic shops won't reopen when or if this change in our lives ever changes back to any semblance of normal. The larger ones might, but even they face a new wrinkle, a new problem. I mentioned it last time we talked about comics, which is the Diamond distributors, which through a weird series of events years and years ago became the only distribution venue for superhero comics, stopped. They shuttered their business. The owner said, we're not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to put my people at risk. We're suspending comic book distribution. We have all these things in the warehouse, but we're not going to distribute them. Which is kind of a 1-2 punch, right? If you're a local comic shop, first you're told by your governor that you can't have your doors open for foot traffic, and then you're told by Diamond Distributor that even if you could have your doors open, you're not getting any product anymore. And at first, Diamond's decision seemed to be merely situational. We have a raging pandemic. Every state, most states are posting exponential growth in confirmed cases. Um, but now it looks, in terms of recent revelations about the whole situation, now it looks much worse than that. Diamond is not only not distributing comics, they're not paying people, even for outstanding contracts. They're not. They've. It's not just that they have suspended operations. It looks like they're just going broke. It looks like they're just dissolving. So that even if, in some fantasy scenario, these quarantines were lifted in, let's say, June, I don't think there'll be a Diamond distributor there to resume operations anyway. The whole thing is in complete chaos. I mean, it's in complete chaos across the retail spectrum, but the comic book industry seems particularly hosed. It looks to me like no matter what happens in 2021, boy oh boy, don't you wish, just this once, don't you wish that you could look into the future in 2021 and see something of how this all shakes out? Do we ever go back to a normal life? And if we don't, what does the life we go back to look like? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm as fascinated as anybody. I hope I live to see it. But one way or another, I think that what large numbers of critics had been viewing as the slow death of comics, I think that has just been accelerated to just the plain old death of comics. So I don't have new issues to show you. I went to my local comic shop when it was still open on New Comic Book Day, and there were 4 staff members. There were no customers other than me. The 4 staff members were trying to keep their spirits up. They had nothing to do, and they could sense that these are college kids. They could sense doom approaching. And we talked, from 6 feet away, and they had disinfectant wipes all over the place, so they were wiping down everything. I bought some comics, and the next day, that comic book chain announced that it was closing its doors for 2 weeks, and that I think has been extended, and I think it will just go right on being extended. They wouldn't be allowed legally to open in Massachusetts anyway, and that's going to be true all over the place. So I don't have any new comics to show you. So the solution that I made last Wednesday, which there are a few of you who really like comics, so I asked, would this be of any interest? And those of you who are interested in comics said that it would be. So the solution that I came up last week was just go through the comics that I already have. Comic book companies, Marvel and DC, have been flirting with the idea of digital, they have the print files for their comics anyway. None of these things are done on drawing boards and sketch boxes anymore. They're all done electronically. I think that's why a lot of them look so bad. But they flirted with the idea of releasing digital comics so that these things continue in some way or other to limp around on New Comic Book Day. I don't have any idea how that's going to shake out, and I don't think that that's a solution long run anyway, because most comic book fans like the physical printed comic. They like to keep them in cardboard long boxes, as I do, and revisit them from time to time. I'm not like most comic book collectors in that I don't or anything collector really, in that I don't care about the shape of the things that I have. I'm hard on my things, and if I want to read an old Thor comic from the 1960s, I pull it out of my long box and read it. I'm not reading it with tweezers. I'm not pulling it out of a plastic bag. So my comics are in varying states of disarray. But I thought, I have another batch. I'm just going to go through these. I'm not organizing them in any way. I'm just going through one chunk at a time so we can talk about comics on Wednesday. And I wanted to show you some of the ones that I have today that I just grabbed. It's the next batch. And the first one is from, it's a 3-issue arc of a story that was in Action Comics in the 1990s. In fact, I think it might have been 1990 itself. It's written by Joe Kelly, and that I didn't care about that. I cared because it's drawn by Pasquale Ferry, and it's the name of the arc is Supergirls. In Action Comics 806, it's this. That main character is Tracy 13. She's a homegirl, baggy pants wearing urban sorceress, a teenager who's an urban sorceress. Then 807 was, this is the daughter of John Henry, the character who was Steel. This is his daughter, who is she sort of inherits his mechanical aptitude and his superpowered Superman suits, his Iron Man-like Superman suits. And then 808 is Supergirl, kind of a young woman who believes that she is an alternate future version daughter of Superman, and who has various ill-defined superpowers. So you have in these 3 issues you have these 3 young women. One is mystical, one is at least nominally Kryptonian, and one is mechanical, and they help Superman out because he has been attacked and severely wounded by a woman named Bayako, I think is her name. She is the wife of an adventurer that Superman knew from an earlier adventure of his, and she blames Superman for her husband's death and wants to kill him. And she has the ability to phase objects and herself, so that she can phase a weapon past Superman's invulnerability and mortally wound him. And she does that a few times in the course of these 3 issues. And it falls to these 3 girls who don't know each other at the beginning. They have to band together. It falls to them to save Superman and fight off this villain. And maybe change her mind, maybe change her heart in the classic tradition of Superman. And I really like these issues. I got them when they originally came out in 19... Is it? Am I right? Is this 1990? Let's see if we can find that. Well, no, I don't see it, but I think it was. Well, one way or another. I mainly got these for Pascal Ferry's artwork, which is just... let me give you... I showed you one example. Let me show you another. Because his artwork is just elaborately beautiful. It doesn't always make a lot of sense. Like, for instance, well, there's another shot of the wounded Superman. Look at how much is going on in that panel. One of the problems that I had with this original issue is when John Henry's daughter realizes that his tech will respond to her because it says that it has detected a genetic match with him through her glove, which of course would not happen. Her glove doesn't have her genetics, but I mainly got this for the incredible artwork, and I reread them for... Look at that! Wow, look at that! Incredible. In fact, there's Pascal Ferry is one of these modern comic book artists who has a bit of ego, a bit more ego than I would like, and you can always spot that because it happens even with artists, or a lot of artists that I love. Walt Simonson is the same way, in that when they do a great panel like this, they will sign it. They will separately sign it. I wanted to tell them to check their egos, but nevertheless, I got these issues mainly for the artwork. Certainly not for the writing, because the writing of these young women is... hello, fellow teenagers. It's just so awful. It's just so awfully, obviously a 50-year-old man trying to simulate the way young people talk these days. Reading it again was painful, but reading again for this Comic Book Wednesday reminded me of something about Pascal Ferry's artwork that I always forget, because I love the visuals. I love his composition. I always forget what a bad artist he is. He's a really good artist. In terms of, boy, every panel that I open up is a wounded Superman. I don't mean to do that. I don't want this to be so masochistic. Every panel that he creates is just beautifully done. But when you read through these issues, you have absolutely no... If you read through them without looking at the words, you have absolutely no idea what's going on from one minute to the next. Just no idea whatsoever. He's, in other words, a terrible sequential storyteller, which is not always true of comic book artists. Some of them are really good at that aspect. So that was a trio. Then we move on to a one-shot. This is Giant Size Invaders number 2. This is a World War II superhero team, Captain America, the original Human Torch, Submariner. The reason this is called Giant Size Invaders number 2 is because there was a Giant Size Invaders number 1 decades before. Let me see if we have a reprinted cover. No, we don't. Okay. This is written by Roy Thomas, of course, and it's drawn by Lee Weeks, who I think is fantastic. Those are 3 of our main characters: Prince Namor the Submariner, the Human Torch, and Miss America, Madeline Frank, who I've mentioned on this channel before. She was one of the first female superheroes of them all. And this is an annual that has a brief introductory story, and then it reprints the first few issues of Roy Thomas's book from decades ago, The Invaders. See, there's 25 cents up there. That's how you know that it's old. Uh, and The Invaders, this is Invaders #1, when it became a bi-monthly comic book with a great John Romita Sr. cover. Look at that. Look at how beautiful that is. But it started with Giant Size Invaders #1. It was offered as a Giant Size Invaders issue, and that's why this is #2. And I just love it. It's a great, big, generous reprint issue. So it has the opening story, which is new. Then it has the first 2 issues of the regular Invaders comic book. Let me see if I can get you another. The other issue that they print also has a, look at that cover. Oh my! And then it has reprints from the 1940s. So you have the best of all 3 worlds, which is just wonderful. So I kept it, of course, especially since this sort of a thing, a special one-off issue like this, which is reprints, you're never going to find this introductory story with Lee Week's artwork is never going to be reprinted anywhere. So you have to get the issue and keep it if you want to revisit it. And what have we got next? Oh my, okay. All right, we have Superboy. Actually, this is 2 Superboys. DC Comics had an event called Crisis on Infinite Earths, where they revamped their continuity to make it simpler. They actually made it much more complicated. Comic book companies should never revamp their continuity. Just let your writers tell the stories they want. That's all. Just let them do it. You're not going to confuse fans. Your fans are paying attention. They have been for a long time. But DC Comics in Crisis on Infinite Earths revamped their continuity, and one of the changes that happened as a result of that is that Superman, Kal-El from the planet Krypton, donned his identity as Superman, his costume, as an adult. He was never Superboy, the hero of Smallville. He never had the costume as a teenager. And longtime DC Comics fans, such as yours truly, bombarded DC Comics with letters right away, saying, "What on earth? You can't do that. You're retroactively invalidating all of our favorite comic books." Superboy, of course, had his own comic book forever and ever. And also Superboy, not Superman. Superboy inspired the Legion of Superheroes. So there were lots of longtime fans who howled in protest and said, well, what about the original Superboy? And DC ignored it, ignored all of that, and then later on a whim, they killed Superman in a famous and best-selling storyline, The Death of Superman. And for a while, Superman was gone. And the writers introduced 4 characters who were all claiming to be Superman. And one of them was this kid in the leather jacket, who turns out to be a clone, an imperfect clone that a laboratory had put together of Superman. And he doesn't have exactly Kryptonian powers. He has a different set of powers. And in this another crossover event, 0 Hour, all the different various pasts and alternate pasts of DC Comics start to fold and blend together. And this was natural. That this would happen as a result. That one of the characters who shows up in the present cool jacket-wearing Superboy's continuity is the original Superboy, the original Kryptonian Superboy, who is, as this issue makes perfectly clear, pretty much infinitely more powerful than this clone Superboy. He's just pretty much infinitely more powerful. As an old Superboy fan, I just love that. And this is another thing. I'm sure that these 0 Hour issues have been collected. There was a main miniseries, but there were also all of these spin-offs in individual comics. I'm sure that these have been collected. I'm sure that this is collected somewhere, but I wasn't about to get all of the rest of that crap just for the 1 or 2 that I wanted. So I made sure to keep the individual issues of 0 Hour that I wanted. Okay, here's another Superboy comic. Well, this is a radically different thing, though. This is from the 1990s again, I believe. This is Jim Mooney artwork. Good Lord. He was a trooper. You would certainly make his deadline. But this was not usual. The Superboy had his own comic forever and ever, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. An extraterrestrial, super hottie teenager having adventures in the American Midwest with his faithful dog. What's not to love? And then DC Comics had Crisis on Infinite Earths and retroactively invalidated that whole reality. And then they gave us this clone jacket-wearing Superboy, and I read those. Some of those, the original run on that Superboy was very good. But the traditional Superboy was gone. And the closest he came to coming back was when the parent company of DC Comics made a TV show, The Adventures of Superboy, starring John Haymes Newton at first, until John Haymes Newton had one too many DUIs. And this was before the internet, but even so, it was starting to threaten to go public. It was starting to be that people would be saying that the TV Superboy is doing the wrong kind of flying. And so he was replaced with Jerry Christopher, who was an even older New York actor who was much more reliable and much more charismatic on screen, I thought, than John Hames Newton. And one way or another, I mean, the show was quite enjoyable. And it spun off a comic. It spun off a comic of its own, Superboy the comic book, which went on for issue after issue after issue. Here, the classic Superboy and Lana Lang are trapped in a painting being done by Bizarro, but Emmett Art. The classic Kevin Maguire art cover. He did a whole bunch of covers for this. They were all wonderful, except for the first issue. The first issue was a photo cover with Jerry Christopher. A rare thing. Comics they flirted with photo covers for a while, at a few different periods in their history. But that was to make sure that readers knew that this was a tie-in to the series, to the TV series, that it was out of continuity, and that it was about the TV series. Hey kids, if you like the TV show, then here's the comic book. So that's why they did the photo cover for the first issue. Oh God help us! All right, well, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. You never know what you're going to get or how old it's going to be. This is from 1967. This is Superman, number 199. This is the classic issue where he races the Flash. That is a great Carmine Infantino cover where you have some people rooting for Superman, others rooting for the Flash. Well, they have a race around the world, and they are limited. They're told certain limits that they have to go through, and we just see them. Like, for instance, the Flash can vibrate, so he can run on water. Superman can't, so he has to swim. But Superman's brute strength serves him in good stead. The Flash can vibrate through an iceberg. Superman has to smash his way through it. And you can tell that this is a very, very old comic book because you would not get away with this as an ad. Not at all. In 2020, not at all. But this is utterly delightful. I just loved it. I read it all the time. And I'm sure that I have it in some sort of collection somewhere. But I just never thought of getting rid of the issue. Okay. All right, then we bounce Whiplash style to the present day. This is Doomsday Clock, number 10 of 12. This was an incredibly delayed standalone miniseries attempting to merge the universe of The Watchmen, of Alan Moore's The Watchmen, into the DC universe and maybe fix some problems in continuity along the way. I only got this because I heard a rumor that it was going to feature the Legion of Superheroes, which is a team of superheroes 1,000 years in the future. It features the Justice Society of America, the original superhero group, DC's 1940s superhero group. But I'd heard that it also featured the Legion, and it does. For a couple of panels, it features Superboy being auditioned by the original members of the Legion of Superheroes. And that's why I got this piece of crap, because of that. And it turned out it was a total waste of time on my part. The story goes on from there, never deals with it again. I knew that this miniseries was going to revamp DC continuity sufficient to allow writers to write not only a Justice Society of America comic book, but also to revive the Legion of Superheroes, which we've seen on this channel and which is now in limbo. Completely in limbo. I missed my chance to get the last issue of the Legion of Superheroes. That week was the week that comic shops were going to be shut down and that Diamond was going to shut down. And they shipped things early, and a lot of specialty shops had those issues on Monday or even Tuesday of that week. And I could have done it. I could have gone and got that issue, but I thought that was the epitome of irresponsibility, to get on public transportation, crowd in with a bunch of other people, all of whom are probably sick, to go to a comic shop to get one issue of one comic. So I didn't do it. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay. All right, we bounce back to 1965. This is Green Lantern. This is the original Green Lantern, Alan Scott, facing off against Hal Jordan, the revamped Green Lantern. And this was a pivotal issue in a lot of ways, because DC Comics had all of these original characters, the ones you saw around that table for the Justice Society of America. And then they decided, after decades of not using them, that they would revamp them all. And oftentimes give no explanation whatsoever for why this Green Lantern is different from the original Green Lantern, why there's a new Flash, Was it a new Adam? Why are these people different? And what about the older ones? And DC gradually had to deal with that. They gradually had to figure out how to deal with that. But in this case, it was just the natural explanation, which was just that the original Green Lantern retired. He's still eternally young because he's a comic book character, but he just allowed the new Green Lantern to carry on. He just retired. Not a very satisfying aim. You would think if someone had sworn their life to defending the innocent and defeating evil, they wouldn't retire. But instead, we got a new Green Lantern with a science fiction background instead of a mystic background, where this new Green Lantern, his ring is science, super science, and he is a space cop. And here we have the two of them together. We have the two of them in with gorgeous Gil Kane artwork that also gives us the story of the original Guardians of the Galaxy, and one rogue Guardian in particular who wants to see the very beginning of the universe. There he sees a hand spinning galaxies into, and that original storyline was DC has gone on to make an enormous amount of hay out of that one story that was written by who wrote this? John Broome came up with that, and just had, we have the Green Lanterns fighting each other. A classic old issue. Again, it's probably been collected somewhere, but I'm not a Green Lantern fan. I got this because I was a fan of the original Green Lantern and because I was a huge Gil Kane fan. Okay, then we were at 65? We're now going to shoot forward to 1973. This is Thor, the mighty Thor. This is John Buscema artwork, but this is written by Jerry Conway, and the main point of this issue, as you can see from the cover, is just Thor and Hercules fighting. There's a misunderstanding, and they iron out the misunderstanding and team up. But first, they fight. And they fight from page after page after page until finally Hercules' father, Zeus, just says, okay, that's enough of that. Tells him to stop. And I have this in a hardcover. The Marvel Masterworks reprints of Thor have moved on and surpassed this era. And I have all of this era in those hardcovers with beautiful, clean pages and durable binding. So I keep this because it's a keepsake, but I don't need this anymore. I was reading these issues in the 70s and just loving them so much. They were just so self-evidently great. And I never imagined that they'd be reprinted. And then Marvel Masterworks, these series of hardcover reprints, I don't think I have any at hand. No, I don't. These series of hardcover reprints came along, and I just knew. They were pricey, but I just knew that this is what I would want. I would want almost all of Thor. From the storyline in which he crosses over from Journey into Mystery, because he didn't start with his own #1 issue. It was a great 5-part storyline that crosses him over from Journey into Mystery to his own book, and his own book retained the numbering from Journey into Mystery, so it never became a first issue. That storyline was fantastic. I love it. It also involves Hercules, and from that storyline on, virtually every era of Thor up until the 1980s, I just loved. So I have all of those in Marvel Masterworks. What is this next one? Oh my! All right, this is The Brave and the Bold. DC Comics revamped their team-up comic, The Brave and the Bold, and just had it regular team-ups. And this is written by Mark Waid and drawn by George Perez. And this is a Batman in the Legion of Superheroes. Not my Legion. It's yet another revamped Legion. Just look for the Soul Patch. Soul Patch will tell you what you need to know about whether or not this is the right Legion. But it's so much fun to watch Batman deal with the Legion. Here he is fighting Karate Kid, who is the unarmed combat expert of the Legion. And he also, at one point, Dex, Brainiac 5, I've had enough of you. It was too good for me to pass up. The idea of Batman and the Legion of Superheroes was just too good to pass up. But I think we're at the 30-minute mark. These are slower than I thought. Well, we'll just take forever to go through my comic book collection. That's all. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop for now because I have twice as many to do here, and we'll never get through that all. I don't want this to be an hour-long video. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, and we'll just do this again next Wednesday. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.